Means a lot.
Yeah,
right.
no, I have absolute confidence you guys are going to do awesome.
All right, let's see. Hopefully it should let me know as people are getting on. Welcome to those of you joining us. We will be getting started in just a few minutes as our attendees get on over the phone and on their computers. Again, welcome to all of you joining us so far. We will be getting started in just a few minutes once everyone has had a chance to tune in. About 3 or 4 minutes, we will get started. Thank you to everyone who's joined us so far. We are just waiting about 1 more minute for everyone to join us at 6:30. In the meantime, if you want to check your email, I sent a link to the presentation. There should also be a link in the chat that I think Kate just sent out so that you can follow along on the slides as our interns present. And I will also be screen sharing so you can tune into my screen to watch the presentation as well. Again, we'll be getting started in just about a minute. Okay, Miriam, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Miriam Judar, and I am the Executive Director at the Citizen Advocacy Center. And I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us for this presentation on the upcoming November election and the provisions of the recently enacted and signed omnibus election bill that you should know about heading into towards Election Day. I think that you will all learn something new tonight, if not a whole lot new. And I hope that you will share this information with your family and friends. This presentation is being recorded and you will be able to rewatch it and share it with others. For those of you that are unfamiliar with CAC or need a refresher about what CAC does, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit legal organization engaged in community lawyering, which includes traditional lawyering and grassroots organizing. We monitor governments for abuses of power, and we pursue public policy advocacy to strengthen the tools, resources, and institutions for self-governance and public participation in Illinois, and to dismantle anti-democratic policies and laws. Today's presentation is part of our robust civic education program. It is informational and educational and should not be considered legal advice. There will be time for questions and answers after the presentation. If any of you have specific questions for a community lawyer, please contact our office by phone or email us. Now I'd like to hand things over to Ben Silver, who is a CAC community lawyer going on 5 years, and he is the director of our summer internship program. So Ben, please take it away.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. I am so excited about tonight's presentation. While we have live streamed some of our live presentations in the past, this is the first of its kind for us that we have done fully virtually. And we hope to have the opportunity to build on this in the future and to take something good out of this whole situation. We have a couple more presentations coming up. As you might know, we have our intern night next week on July 29th. And our interns are presenting again on August 5th on civic advocacy and mobilization during coronavirus. And then you can look forward to a candidate boot camp later in the summer or early fall, where we teach people how to run for office. We'll be running at least one of those and hopefully have some more information about getting on the ballot during a pandemic at that time. I will be sharing the presentation tonight that accompanies this webinar on my screen. So that is one way to tune into the PowerPoint. I also emailed it out to everyone who was registered as of about an hour and a half ago. So that's another good way to follow along. And we will make that available to the public going forward so that anyone can follow along with this presentation after we have it recorded. There are a few ways to do Q&A during this. One is in the Zoom platform. You should find a button for Q&A and you can ask questions on there and we will get to them following the intern's presentation. Presentation will be about 30 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and expect to wrap up maybe around 7:45 or so. Another way is you can email us at cac@citizenadvocacycenter.org. And just for tonight, I'm going to say you can text me a question. My number is 847-987-1632. Please only do that if you're having issues asking questions elsewhere, but I want to make sure everyone can get through. So again, my number 847-987-1632. And of course, you can always ask us questions up to and through Election Day. We are here as a free community legal resource to answer all of those questions about the election or anything else. So reach out to us through email, through our website forms, over the phone, and we will get back to you. This election is very, very important. It is, during this pandemic, I think it's a chance for us to show the robustness of our processes and to make sure that we have accountability even during a crisis. I think we are well prepared here in Illinois. We have a bill that covers this election that is making voting accessible and robust. It's giving people a number of safe options to make sure that they have the opportunity this year, as our interns will get into. But we still need to share all that information. We need to educate voters, and we need to ensure that this entire process is transparent and accountable. And that starts tonight with our interns and their presentation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our 2 high school interns this summer. Shreya Joshi is a rising junior at Waubonsie Valley High School. She firmly believes in the power of the youth and Generation Z's ability to create more inclusive and tolerant society. And as such, she founded the program TEAL, that's Tolerance, Engagement, Action, and Learning, where she strives to share her passion for political activism with other students through her civic engagement workshops, like this one. Kate Lee is a rising senior at Naperville Central High School, where her interest in law and the community originated from competing on the speech team and participating in her school's Junior State of America chapter. As a debate agent for JSA, she has engaged her fellow students in discussing critical topics in current events and organized events for registration, for voter registration and election awareness, like this one. Without further ado, I am going to share the presentation on my screen, and Kate and Shreya will take it away. Thank you.
Kate, I think you're on mute.
Can you guys all hear me now?
Yeah, it's good now.
Yes, now we can.
Awesome. I think I was just talking, but I still need to get a little bit more used to properly using Zoom technology. I just want to reiterate what has already been said. Thank you guys all so much for coming out and hopefully educating yourselves and staying informed about recent legislation passed to protect the integrity of our elections. We really hope that this presentation is helpful in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so unfortunate that coronavirus had to hit us this year, especially given that it's such a consequential year in terms of electoral politics, but it did. And that's why we wanted to focus on this topic today, because it's so relevant in today's time, and it's important because no one should have to jeopardize their health in order to exercise their constitutional right to vote. So with that, let's get started.
Awesome. So we're just going to reiterate our backgrounds really quickly and establish the fact that you can always contact us even after this presentation is over. My name's Kate Lee again. I'm currently a rising senior at Naperville Central, and the second email address is mine. So feel free to contact me if you ever have any questions or concerns.
Yeah, and my name is Shreya Joshi. I'm a rising junior at Waubonsie Valley. I'm the other high school intern here at the Citizen Advocacy Center, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today. I also have my email listed in case you have any questions or concerns, so please don't hesitate to reach out. So the first thing that we wanted to focus on today was the impact of COVID on elections so far. Due to coronavirus, many states across the country have either postponed primary elections or completely switched to voting by mail with extended deadlines. In fact, the only 3 states to continue with their primary elections as scheduled were Florida, Arizona, and our very own Illinois. These primary elections occurred on March 17th earlier this year. In Illinois specifically, voter turnout drastically dropped amid social distancing requirements and fear of COVID transmission. Just to put into context how truly depressing voter turnout was in our state, we provided a few statistics comparing the 2016 primary elections to the 2020 primary elections. So in Chicago in 2016, we saw 720,812 people turn out to vote. However, in 2020, that number dropped by 37% to 460,465 people showing up to vote, which are numbers that we typically see in Chicago's mayoral elections. In 2016, in Cook County, we saw 476,260 people turn up to vote. However, in the past primary election, this number dropped to 385,349. DuPage County, which many of us reside in, had 289,589 people turn up to vote in 2016. However, this number dropped to 91,000 people, which is approximately 14% of DuPage County's registered voters. So overall, the 2020 turnout in Illinois was 70% of the voter turnout in 2016, which obviously is not optimal and really shows the need for safer voting methods. On the same day that the Illinois primary elections occurred, Florida and Arizona's primary elections also continued. However, it's interesting because Florida and Arizona actually experienced higher overall turnout levels than compared to the 2016 primary elections despite the coronavirus outbreak. Florida and Arizona's success can be attributed to the heavy investment and advertisement of voting by mail and early voting systems, which are two very safe voting methods that we highly recommend and will be covering extensively later in this presentation. For reference, we provided a few statistics to demonstrate just how effective these methods are in a pandemic. So in the Florida Democratic primary, overall, 1.739 million people voted in this year's primary elections, which is a sizable increase from the 1.7 million people who voted in 2016. In Arizona specifically, in 2020, we saw a total turnout of 468,000 people, which is a significant increase from 410,000 people in 2016. And considering that 380,000 people voted early this year, it's safe to extrapolate that this high turnout was largely caused by safer early voting and voting by mail options. Given the exceedingly low turnout that Illinois experienced, Illinois passed the Senate Bill 1863, also known as the Omnibus Election Bill, which aimed to expand mail-in voting and reinvest in early voting systems. But we will be covering this bill along with these two voting methods in more detail in upcoming slides.
All right, so on the next slide, we kind of just want to demonstrate what's happening on November 3rd and why it's so important. So as we all know, we're going to be voting for our president November 3rd, but Illinois also has a variety of elections occurring at the state, local, and federal level. So just to demonstrate that, the Class 2 United States Senate seat, which is currently held by Senator Dick Durbin, is going to be up for election. Current Senator Dick Durbin is actually running for his 5th term, but be sure to try and just check in on how you feel about his performance in order to determine whether or not you want him to stay there in the upcoming election. Additionally, on top of that, all 18 of Illinois' congressional seats in the House of Representatives are also up for election. And at the state level, all 118 seats in the Illinois House of Representatives are up for election, whereas in the state Senate, 20 out of the 59 seats are up for election. Additionally, there's also a variety of judicial elections. At the state level, in the Illinois Supreme Court, 3 out of the 7 seats are up for election, and 10 seats in the Illinois appellate courts are also up for re-election. On top of that, something really interesting to note is the fact that Illinois actually has a referendum on the ballot this year, specifically one with regards to the Illinois fair tax, which was introduced back in May of 2019. If approved of, the Illinois fair tax would become formally part of the Illinois Constitution. What the Illinois fair tax essentially aims to accomplish is changing Illinois' income tax from a fair and flat tax rate to a graduated income tax rate. So basically, the more taxable income one has, the higher the income tax rate is. So what this means is that incomes between $250,000 and $500,000 will be taxed at a rate of 7.75%, whereas incomes between $100,000 and $250,000 will remain the same rate, namely 4.95%. Finally, tax rates on incomes less than $100,000 will be reduced. If you're interested in seeing how the Illinois fair tax is going to be impacting your income specifically, then please feel free to click on the second hyperlink in this presentation, and it'll take you to Governor Pritzker's website. And there you'll see a calculator, which upon inputting your personal income, you can specifically see how the Illinois fair tax is going to impact you.
The last topic that we wanted to touch quickly upon before going more into depth about voting procedures and how this pandemic will affect the 2020 general elections is, why does this matter? Why is it so important that we have free and fair elections in the midst of COVID-19? Well, democratic elections provide the basis for a legitimate government, and this legitimacy can really only exist when policymakers truly reflect the values and opinions of their constituents and the communities that they represent. Exercising your constitutional right to vote is arguably the most effective way of participating in democracy, of becoming civically engaged, and ensuring that your voice is heard and that you are represented at a local, state, and federal level. Because at the end of the day, policy affects you and your lifestyle, and exercising your right to vote ensures that someone is always actively advocating on your behalf. Beyond voting, an election can truly only be free and fair when all voters receive comprehensive, accurate, and reliable information about the voting process and the candidates on the ballot. And that's why we chose this topic today to cover. We hope that this presentation is informative and answers all questions that you might have.
All right, so now we're just going to be taking a look at how COVID-19 is prospectively going to affect the 2020 general election with some recent legislation that's been passed, firstly at the federal level.
Later in this presentation, we'll be going into a lot of depth and detail about what precautions Illinois is specifically taking in the face of coronavirus. However, just as a quick preface, we wanted to quickly touch on what's occurring at a federal level. So on March 27th of 2020, earlier this year, President Trump signed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, otherwise known as the CARES Act. And this act specifically allocates $400 million to all 50 states to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus domestically or internationally for the 2020 federal election cycle. Of this $400 million, Illinois receives $16.7 million in funding. These funds will go directly towards ensuring that every citizen has the ability to cast a vote in fair conditions, ensuring that all voters are properly informed of the candidates, their political party, and their platforms, and ensuring that at-risk populations aren't deprived of the right to vote. Because each state is handling this situation differently with the resources allocated, we will only be covering Illinois-specific procedures and legislation in this presentation.
All right, so because of how much federal money has been allocated, we're also going to be taking a look at the generally agreed upon practices that electoral officials believe can help secure the integrity of elections this voting season. On the 9th slide, we'll take a look at each general procedure and then discuss a little bit on how they relate to Illinois. So specifically, first, a lot of electoral officials agree that polling places have to be modified. Some people believe that because polling places can quickly become very crowded, they believe that potentially polling places shouldn't necessarily be as relevant. However, it's important to recognize that not all voters have access to mail or internet, limiting the accessibility of, for example, voting by mail. Polling places also provide language assistance, which is super important for voters who might not have English as their first language. So polling places should definitely stay open even amidst coronavirus. To ensure everyone can vote safely, however, a lot of electoral officials have pointed out that polling places should potentially adopt things like alcohol-based sanitizer, water, and potential wipes in order to make sure that everybody can clean themselves and practice hygienic practices in order to make sure that the potential of COVID-19 is ultimately decreased. Additionally, states should also consider moving polling places to other settings or determining alternative settings if the risk becomes too great. Some polling places take place in communities that serve high-risk populations, such as senior care facilities. So a lot of states, including Illinois, are trying to make sure that polling places aren't being located in these communities that serve high-risk populations. Another step that should be taken in order to decrease the number of people that are present at polling places is to try and decrease the number of people in lines. And one way that can be done is by expanding early voting. Early voting is exactly what it sounds like. It allows you to cast your ballot at polling places before November 3rd. The locations that offer early voting will be described more extensively later on in this presentation. But as a preface, some states don't have early voting, which means that citizens can only vote on November 3rd. Luckily, Illinois has early voting as an option, which increases the number of days that voters can cast their ballots and thereby lessens human-to-human contact. On top of that, universal mail-in voting or voting by mail, which is also exactly what it sounds like. After applying to vote by mail, a voter can send their ballot via the mail, is definitely an option that more states should consider, because this essentially guarantees that there's no human-to-human contact. Currently, anybody in Illinois, regardless of their background, can choose to opt into voting, to voting by mail, which is definitely an issue that we're also going to be talking about more extensively later on in this presentation. The final step that a lot of electoral officials agree upon and definitely emphasize right now is modifying voter registration. Typically, a lot of people get registered as voters at government offices, but in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and because of the fact that we do want to reduce human contact, online voter registration is crucial. And on the next slide, Shreya is going to be talking about how that applies to Illinois.
So going off of that, we wanted to cover the best practices for voter registration in a pandemic. Obviously, there are a lot of different ways, and normally you just go to a governmental office and register to vote in person. But in order to limit physical contact and to adhere to social distancing guidelines, we recommend using these two methods to make sure that you can register to vote. So first off, there's automatic voter registration. Illinois was actually the first state in the Midwest to sign automatic voter registration into law on August 28th of 2017, so almost 3 years ago now. Essentially, automatic registration streamlines the way that we can register to vote. If you've recently been to the DMV and you have either renewed your license, recertified your license, changed your address, obtained a temporary visitor's driver's license, or obtained a state ID card, then the information you provided in order to apply for those services was also likely used for you to register to vote simultaneously. If you have completed any of these services that I just mentioned and you still aren't registered to vote, this would only be possible if you specifically chose the opt-out option and chose to not register. If you're unsure of whether automatic registration applies to you and if you're registered to vote or not, please click on the first hyperlink on this slide, which will take you to a site that will determine if you're registered to vote. If you check and hey, it turns out that you're not registered to vote, the second hyperlink on the slide will take you to a website that allows you to register online. So there's no need to go to a DMV to register. You can simply register online with the second hyperlink. The deadline for online voter registration is October 18th. This deadline is 12 days after the deadline to register to vote in person, which means that you have more time to register via online. Given social distancing protocol, this is arguably the safest way to register in a pandemic to avoid potential COVID transmission and human-to-human contact. Plus, there's the added benefit of an extended deadline, which obviously doesn't hurt. We strongly urge you to consider online voter registration this year as opposed to in-person registration, as it's just a safer and more effective option.
All right, so if we're pretending that in the hypothetical case, October 18th has passed and you still haven't registered as a voter, there are some last-minute voter registration procedures you can get involved in. The first option is grace period registration, which basically means that you can still register to vote until November 2nd. However, if you choose to do so, you must cast your ballot directly after you register. So there's kind of that downfall of not being able to register to vote and then having that time frame and time to yourself to decide who you're going to vote for. So while you can get registered as a voter after October 18th, just know that if you do decide to engage in grace period registration, you're going to have to choose who to vote for almost directly after you register as a voter. We're going to be going a little bit more into depth on where you can engage in grace period registration, but typically grace period registration can be done at the office of your election authority, which is typically your county clerk. They can also usually be done at permanent polling places established by your county clerk and at most other early voting sites. In case you missed grace period registration on top of online registration, you can also engage in same-day registration, which is exactly what it sounds like, namely voting at your polling place on election day and also getting registered on the spot there. However, in order to engage in same-day registration, you have to bring two types of identification for this to work. One form has to show your current name and address, but there are a variety of identifications you can bring. It can be your driver's license, your state ID, or even just a piece of mail that contains your name and address. However, just as sort of a warning, we don't really highly recommend same-day registration because it often results in a lot of people. And because that increases the possibility of COVID-19 transmission, as Shreya has already established, we really highly encourage doing online voter registration or checking to see if you've been automatically registered as a voter by engaging in the DMV services.
Since we just kind of covered voter registration and the actions that our federal government is taking to protect our elections, over the next few slides, we'll be going into more detail about legislation that Illinois specifically has passed to ensure a free and fair election in the midst of COVID, and what measures we recommend you take to vote. On the next slide, we'll be covering Senate Bill 1863, which is arguably the most important piece of legislation regarding Illinois' elections in the midst of the coronavirus outbreak. This bill is also known as the Illinois Omnibus Election Bill. This bill was passed in response to the poor turnout that we saw in the primary elections. and it aims to expand mail-in voting access for the November 3rd general election in anticipation of social distancing guidelines that will make in-person voting understandably more challenging. This bill requires all Illinois election officials to send vote-by-mail ballot applications to any voter who has cast a ballot in the last 3 years by no later than August 1st. So this means that anyone who has voted in the 2018 general election, the 2019 consolidated elections, or the 2020 primaries will receive a ballot application. Additionally, this law also applies to anyone who has registered to vote or changed their address after the 2020 primaries. They will also receive a vote-by-mail ballot application. Finally, this bill also allows voters to electronically request and return ballot applications. If you haven't voted in an election in the past 3 years but would like to vote in the upcoming 2020 general election, we will be providing the links to do so in the upcoming slides.
All right, so here on the next slide, we have sort of an overview of what other topics the Omnibus Election Bill covers. So the first thing it does on top of trying to establish a greater accessibility to voting by mail is also solidifying early voting procedures. So we've already gone over early voting. It essentially allows you to cast your ballot before Election Day on November 3rd at a variety of different locations, typically the office of your county clerk. However, this procedure essentially guarantees that in most cases, you'll be able to early vote by at least October 19th. And if you're going to do so, the hours typically will look like on Monday to Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. You'll be able to go to early voting locations and cast your ballot there. On weekends and holidays, you'll be able to engage in early voting from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. On top of that, the Omnibus Election Bill also allows Election Day, which is November 3rd, to become a state holiday. So that means essentially school will be canceled and might be turned into polling places. On top of that, the Omnibus Election Bill also allows for curbside voting, which is exactly what it sounds like. In curbside voting, you drive up, get handed a ballot, and then fill it out, namely the ballot, in your car. There will be at least 2 election judges from opposite parties. So for example, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party per vehicle, and the voter can mark the ballot without interference. Again, curbside voting is just a bit safer than normal voting that you might see at a polling place.
So in earlier slides, we mentioned early voting as a successful method to safely vote in a pandemic. This is because it spreads out the number of people at polling stations at a given time instead of a concentrated amount of people in a location on a singular date. So in this slide, we're going to be concentrating on the specifics of early voting and what details to take into consideration when you're deciding whether or not you want to vote early. So first of all, it's really important to note that you don't need an excuse to vote early. Anybody can vote early. And given this pandemic situation, there's all the more reason to do so. Second, please don't vote early and then cast another vote on November 3rd. This is really difficult to do in the first place, considering that you have to sign an affidavit for provisional ballots. However, double voting is considered a felony, so please just don't do that. Avoid going and voting in person on November 3rd if you choose to vote early. In Illinois, you aren't required to show any form of identification in order to vote early. However, bringing an ID can be helpful if there are any issues with voter registration, signature, or address, and it can even speed up the process at some polling stations. Some examples of acceptable ID include driver's licenses, state ID cards, passports, and insurance cards. But there are other forms of ID that would also be acceptable. So although it's not necessary, we still recommend that you bring an ID anyway if you do choose to vote early. In terms of where you can vote early, location generally varies county by county. However, any place that offers grace period registration will also allow you to vote early. The first hyperlink in this slide takes you to a page for DuPage County that indicates typical locations of polling stations for early voting. If you do not currently reside in DuPage County, the second hyperlink in the slide will take you to a page where you can select the jurisdiction that you do live in. Based off of that, it will take you to the typical locations of polling stations in that area for early voting. It's important to note that if you do choose to vote early, your ballot won't be counted until Election Day. This is still true even if you do change your mind about who to vote for. So please make sure that you're sure of your decision and you're confident in your candidate before voting early. Finally, one last note. Early voting will definitely be open at the latest by October 19th, which is 15 days before the general election. However, Illinois' early voting policies are super expansive and progressive, which means that early voting can be a possibility for you up to 40 days before the general election. However, if you do choose to vote at the beginning of the early voting period, there may be a limited number of polling stations available for you to vote at. As the early voting period goes on, the number of polling stations for you to choose from will increase. So if this is something that's important to you, please keep that in mind when deciding whether or not to choose the early voting option.
All right. So now we're just going to be talking about voting by mail. In order to vote by mail, the steps are pretty simple. The first thing you have to do is obtain a vote by mail application. Again, as we already covered, because of the omnibus election bill, if you voted in the past 3 years, you're going to get sent that application to you directly by August 1st from your local electoral authority. However, if you haven't voted in the past 3 years, or if it's your first time voting, then feel free to click the first hyperlink in this presentation, and it'll take you to an application to vote by mail. Please fill out the application and then return it to your local electoral authority, which is typically your county clerk. Do not return it to the Illinois State Board of Elections. This could potentially cause delays in having your ballot get sent to you. So make sure you send it to the correct local authority. Feel free to click on that hyperlink, which basically takes you to a page where upon entering your jurisdiction, you will get the contact information as well as the address of your local electoral authority so you know who to send it to and how. Once you've returned this application to vote by mail, you will get sent your ballot and then you can return the ballot and vote accordingly. Just as a general tip, we really strongly encourage all of you, if you are interested in voting by mail, to send in your application as early as possible. The technical deadline in order to send your application is October 29th, just a couple of days before November 3rd. But the earlier you send in your application, that means typically the easier it is for your local electoral authority to get your ballot sent back to you. Additionally, if you end up sending your application to vote by mail on October 29th, but then there's some problems with your mail delivery systems or some technical difficulties, then that could potentially cause delays in having you receive the ballot, which again is pretty problematic. Now that we've covered how to actually vote by mail, we do want to go over the fact that potentially your ballot could get rejected. The most common reason for this is that you aren't a registered voter. So in order to make sure that doesn't happen, just feel free to go back to that link we've already provided and register online pretty much as soon as possible. Again, your ballot could also get rejected if you vote in person. So like Shreya covered earlier in this presentation, for example, casting a ballot during early voting and then voting again in person on November 3rd is pretty difficult, but if you manage to do so, it's a felony. So don't vote twice. So on top of that, if the envelope containing your ballot that you send is open, then that could potentially get your ballot rejected as well. So make sure the envelope containing your ballot is properly sealed. Another reason as to why one's ballot might get rejected is if the certification envelope, which basically contains your ballot and requires your signature, doesn't have a signature or has a signature that is radically different from the one your local electoral authority has on record for you, your ballot might get rejected because of that. So now is not the time to experiment with a crazy new signature. Make sure you stick to what you typically have in order to make sure that your ballot doesn't get rejected. On top of that, we just want to make sure and sort of solidify the fact that if your ballot is rejected, you'll still get notified within 2 days of the rejection. If you had a problem with your signature and your ballot was rejected as a result of that, you can submit a statement. And once you've submitted a statement, your ballot will be counted as valid and you can get your vote in that way. If your ballot was delivered with an open envelope and as a result was rejected, you can actually also vote in person or request another vote by mail ballot, ultimately showing that even if your ballot gets rejected, don't immediately despair. There are still some ways for you to get your vote in.
So we've mentioned a lot of deadlines on the previous slides, and we know that it can get a bit confusing. So on this next slide, we've compiled a consolidated list of all important dates so that this information is centralized and much easier to find. We listed these dates in a chronological order and sorted it by color to make it easier to digest and comprehend. If it's highlighted in red, it pertains to important dates regarding voter registration. If it's highlighted in green, it pertains to dates involving early voting. And finally, if it's highlighted in yellow, it's relevant if you choose to vote using the vote by mail option.
So as you can see on the 19th slide, we've also categorized just the dates and deadlines that you should be aware of based on what sort of activity you're engaging in. So I'm going to go through them really quickly so we can sort of establish an overarching view of what the general timeline for voting looks like. So first, if you're interested in getting registered as a voter, which hopefully some of you are, the first thing that you should be aware of is that if you're getting registered as a voter in person, for example, at a local governmental office, which isn't our number one recommendation, but is still definitely an option, the deadline for that is October 6th of 2020. But if you're getting registered as a voter online, the deadline to do so on that link we provided earlier is October 18th of 2020. If you miss those deadlines, grace period registration is available from October 7th to November 2nd. So just remember those dates in case you ever slip up and forget the deadlines for voter registration in person or online. If you're interested in voting by mail, you typically will have your vote by mail application sent to you by August 1st of 2020. And make sure to send that application back into your local electoral authority by October 29th of 2020. Hopefully you can do that earlier, but try and get that in by at the latest October 29th. If you're voting by mail, additionally, make sure you have your actual ballot sent in and postmarked by November 3rd of 2020. If you're interested in early voting, that'll open up at least by October 19th and will close on November 2nd.
On the next slide, we are covering something called ballot access relief. This doesn't affect how you can vote, but it does affect who you can vote for. So on April 21st, earlier this year, the U.S. District Court granted ballot access relief to all Illinois third-party and independent candidates. So essentially, this order authorizes unaffiliated candidates to collect signatures electronically. Traditionally, it's collected in person, but understandably, due to this pandemic, they're condoning the collection of signatures electronically. Additionally, third-party candidates will also now need only 10% of the original petition signature requirements to get on the ballot. And finally, the last thing that this order mandates is that the petition submission deadline has been extended from June 20th to August 7th. So it's important to note that this order exclusively applies to this year's general election in November. So far, the U.S. District Court hasn't mandated that this order also be applied to future elections. So if you see more candidates than usual on the ballot this November, this is most likely the reason why.
All right, so on the 21st slide, this is just a general compilation of our resources. We've provided a lot of links throughout this presentation, and in case you ever want to go back to this and sort of access the links, we wanted to make sure that it's really easy to do so. The 21st slide is basically just all of the links that we've provided compiled together. The first one allows you to check your registration status. The second one is a link that takes you to the ISBE so that you can register online as a voter. The third one is an application to vote by mail. And the fourth one actually allows you to determine the specific contact information and address of the local electoral authority you can send your vote by mail application to. The fifth and sixth ones namely pertain to early voting, specifically for DuPage County and then anybody in the state of Illinois.
However, if you have any questions about this process in the future and these links don't suffice to your needs, please don't hesitate to reach out to the CAC. They would be more than happy to help you with any questions or concerns that you might have pertaining to this year's election.
All right, so on the 22nd slide, we're just going to be going over some practicalities, some worries, and some thoughts associated with voting by mail and more generally, the November 3rd general election. So one big worry that's been floating across not just Illinois, but the country in general, potentially as a result of the administration's expressions, is the worry about voter fraud, namely tampering with somebody's ballots and potentially trying to disguise as somebody you're not. However, a lot of states have actually implemented popular systems like voting by mail extensively in the past. For example, if we take a look at the state of Washington, it's really relied on voting by mail for the past couple of election cycles, but hasn't seen any widespread evidence of voter fraud, making the possibility of voter fraud essentially non-existent. Additionally, and on top of that, tampering with ballots is nearly impossible because they're printed on a super specific stock, and they're also associated with specific tracking systems like barcodes, making it all the more difficult to tamper with ballots and making the possibility of voter fraud that less feasible. There are some logistics that are associated with voting by mail for the upcoming election. One big worry that a lot of electoral officials across the country have is because voting by mail is going to be expanding so much this November 3rd, they're worried that printing, mailing, and counting millions of ballots may strain electoral officials. So that's just something to keep in mind, and ultimately emphasizes the importance of trying to get in your vote by mail application as soon as you can, because that reduces the possibility that your local electoral official will get caught up in the frenzy of November 3rd. Another reminder is that you just want to have your postmarked dates for your ballots, specifically your vote by mail ballots, to be November 3rd. So for example, if you're casting your ballot and sending it to your local electoral authority, make sure it's postmarked by at least November 3rd. There have been some troubles and difficulties with this in the past. So as soon as you've decided who to vote for, please do try and send in that ballot as early as possible in order to make sure that your ballot just doesn't get caught up in the frenzy of the general election day. Another worry that a lot of individuals have had in the recent past is just the worries surrounding USPS, which, as we all know, is the most widespread postal service that Americans use. Recently, the USPS has been encountering some financial difficulties as a result of COVID-19. But in April of this year, the Trump administration actually rejected some bailouts to try and provide financial services and help to the USPS, which is still struggling financially to this day. Considering that a lot of us are going to be relying upon USPS in order to vote by mail in the upcoming couple of months, do feel free to try and click that hyperlink in this slide, because it'll take you to an online petition where you can try and urge the presidential administration to ultimately increase financial service and help to the USPS.
On this last slide, we included this slide for those of you who want to go beyond voting and more actively participate in the electoral process. So hopefully this applies to everyone on this call. Firstly, there's hosting a voter registration drive. This could be as simple as making sure that all your friends and families are registered to vote, posting a link to an online voter registration site on your social media channels, and asking your friends to do the same. However, if you're interested in hosting a full-out voter registration drive, we recommend checking out New Voters, which is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to training interested individuals to host voter registration drives in their communities. They provide a lot of resources, guides, and professional services to do so. So if you are interested, please check them out. The second way is just to educate yourself about voting procedures and rules. Spreading misinformation is a sure way to reduce voter turnout and negatively impact this year's election. However, everyone on this call has already effectively taken care of that step by attending this presentation. So please just make sure to correctly educate your friends and families on these issues as well. Finally, voting by the methods that we mentioned earlier in this presentation, such as early voting and voting by mail, are the safest and most effective ways to stay safe and exercise your right to vote. Although it might not seem this way, voting really isn't an individual act. It's a civic duty that's aimed to produce collective public good. And just remember that when you vote, you're not just voting for yourself. You're voting for those of us who can't vote. You're voting for your friends, for your family, and for your community. So please think about them when you cast your ballot in this November. And that concludes the content that we wanted to cover for this presentation today. Again, thank you all so much for joining us and being here today. We really appreciate it. And we would also like to specifically thank Ben and Miriam. This presentation today wouldn't have been possible without their guidance or support. So a huge shout out to them.
Yeah, and if you want to support their work in the future and just generally get involved with what the CIC is doing, please do consider dropping in at the CIC Summer Intern Night on July 29th at 6:30. The links for that have been sent out in recent emails. We're also hosting a civic advocacy and mobilization forum on August 5th at 6:30 as well. So if you're interested in that general subject, please do consider dropping in. So after we've covered this content, we just want to make sure that if any of you guys have any concerns or questions, we'd really be down to addressing them right now.
I see one from Mr. Sean Healy. Do you anticipate a shortage of election judges given pandemic-related health concerns? Actually, yes. In the primary elections, we've already seen a huge shortage of election judges, and that's why in Illinois specifically, the age required to be an election judge has been lowered to 16, so that since young people are more likely to go out in a pandemic and are healthier, obviously, they're more likely to be election judges. So hopefully there's not going to be another shortage in this year's November elections, but we'll have to see.
Okay, that's the only question we have so far. I want to just, while we are waiting for more questions, if anyone has them, I want to thank Shreya and Kate. That was amazing. I can hear the applause from across our region from all the people tuning in, even though we unfortunately can't be in person to see everyone here. So thank you both. That was incredible. I'm really, really impressed by all the information. And I think that part of the reason we don't have more questions right now is because he covered everything. So
That's reassuring. I hope like everybody just feels encouraged to reach out. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a question. If you just have a concern, me and Shreya would be happy to talk about it too. So yeah, like whether you want to drop it in the chat or maybe specifically speak up if you aren't really interested in typing the question out, we're open for that too.
So the second question relates to the decentralization of Illinois and concerns over different election authorities implementing them differently. So I think for the voting by mail option, all election authorities are required by the Omnibus Election Bill to send voting by mail ballot applications by August 1st. So regardless of what county or district that you live, or what jurisdiction that you live in, you will receive a vote by mail ballot application by August 1st. If you have voted in the last 3 years. But hey, if you haven't, then we also provided the link where you could request to obtain one from your local election authority.
And I want to point out that Kate and Shreya brought up to me and Miriam earlier this week that is something that we are going to actively monitor, that we are somewhat concerned about that all the counties, I think that here in the Chicago region, we're pretty confident with the type of citizen watchdogs that we have watching for these, that people will get their mail-in ballot applications in line with the state law, but we are exploring ways to monitor that throughout the state.
All right. So I see a third question that says, will there only be one voting place per county? That is not going to be the case. Actually, for a lot of counties, there is different polling places across a county. The most common and most secure place is typically the office of the county clerk. So that's always a surefire way to cast your ballot. But typically, as the date draws closer and closer to November 3rd, you'll actually be able to see more and more polling places opening up at municipal centers, at schools. As we mentioned, the Omnibus Election Bill officially does make November 3rd a state holiday and potentially turns schools into polling places. So that definitely increases the number of polling places across counties and just the opportunities to vote overall as well.
And I want to follow up on that there's some confusion with the initial law when this new bill passed, and that might be where Kathy's question about the one voting place per county came from. Initially, the bill actually ensures that there is one central location where anyone from any precinct can vote on election day as a fail-safe in case they can't go to the school or the nursing home or wherever their usual precinct is, that they could go to that central location and vote on election day. So that is actually an extra option, but normal precincts, normal local voting places will be open on election day.
All right. So the next question is my thoughts and Shreya's thoughts generally about the Omnibus Bill, whether it went far enough or if it included issues that, if it didn't include issues that should have been there. I guess I'll start off just because I read the question, but I think right now the Omnibus Election Bill it actually did like a decent job in my opinion. For example, early voting and voting by mail has actually been accessible in Illinois for the past couple of election cycles, and people have in the past couple of election cycles don't really need a particular reason to do so. So it's been pretty accessible, especially in comparison to a lot of states across the country. The Omnibus Election Bill's decision to just send out those applications directly to voters, I personally thought that was really like taking it a step beyond, because it was kind of like the state was doing its own job of trying to inform citizens. So I personally thought that the Omnibus Election Bill was quite sufficient in that manner. Some of my concerns do lie with the lack of specificity on certain issues. One thing that kind of worried me was the fact that it didn't specifically address the locations of polling places. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, sometimes polling places are located in communities with high-risk populations, such as senior care facilities. So I really hoped that the Omnibus Election Bill would specify, like, specifically putting polling places in communities that don't necessarily have those high-risk populations. But typically, I think that might actually be done by localities across the state. So hopefully, while the Omnibus Election Bill didn't necessarily address that aspect, hopefully it'll still be covered by individual counties and individual townships across the state.
Yeah, Kate did a really good job of answering that question. I agree with everything she said. Just one thing that I'd add, I'm actually really surprised that this wasn't already a thing before the coronavirus pandemic. I think this bill should have been passed much earlier in terms of like sending vote by mail applications to all registered voters in the last 3 years. To me, that just seems like a common sense thing to do. It's more effective, more efficient. I don't really know why it wasn't a thing earlier. But in terms of how Illinois is doing in comparison to all the other 50 states, I think we're honestly doing a really good job. We're really lucky that this bill was passed, because in some other like Republican majority states, the voting isn't as expansive. And even like, I think in Arkansas, I was reading an article the other day, there's like only one polling station every like few hundred miles. And it's terrible, especially for at-risk communities who can't afford to like go out there and like vote. So yeah, that's just my opinion. I think we're doing a really good job as a whole, and I'm just a bit surprised that it wasn't passed earlier. The next question I see is, how do you apply to become an election judge? I can drop the link to do that in the chat, but the requirements honestly aren't that much. I'm pretty sure you just have to be 16 or older and like a dedicated high school student, and like that's it.
Yeah, I think like the requirements are you have to maintain, I think, a C average in high school. And typically, like if you don't happen to reside in DuPage County, I believe like the applications can be found at on the website of your county clerk. All right. So the next question is, wouldn't it make more sense to just send ballots to all registered voters than applications and then ballots? So the answer to this is that or at least like my answer is, for registered voters, you can't automatically vote by mail, if that makes sense. You have to apply to vote by mail, and then only then can you like actually get the ballot in the mail, and then send it to your local electoral authority. For some individuals, for example, if you live overseas, I believe, or if you reside in a hospital, for example, you can choose an option to just automatically be enrolled in voting by mail, so that you don't have to reapply to vote by mail every year. But for normal citizens who aren't necessarily belonging to those demographics, then you have to apply to vote by mail before you can actually receive your ballot and then send your ballot into your local electoral authority, if that makes sense. All right, so our next question is, already applied for early mail-in ballot, missed by when it should be mailed in once received. Okay, so the technical deadline for mailing in your ballot is October 29th of 2020. Since we do recommend sending in that ballot earlier, we want to specify that once you have received that application, you can only actually, like your local electoral authority will only actually be accepting the applications 40 days before the election, so September 24th of 2020. So basically the window for you to send in that application is between September 24th and October 29th. Hopefully, if you can, please do send that application closer to the September 24th end of the spectrum, but it's great to see but it's great to see that you've received the application to vote by mail.
So our next question is, in order to register online, isn't having a signature with the DMV or other state agency on file necessary? If so, must these individuals register in person? Also, will mail-in voters be required to pay postage? So your second question is a lot faster, so I'll just answer that first. I'm pretty sure they're required to pay postage. I could be wrong. I'll have to double check and maybe get back to you on that, but like, hopefully it's not super expensive, so it won't be like that big of a deal, but I don't think the state is allocating any funding towards individuals who might need it to pay postage for mail-in voting.
Sure, you are correct that postage is required if you mail it in. The bill does allow election authorities to set up drop boxes, and for instance, here in in Chicago where I live, there will be drop boxes set up for voters to drop off a ballot without mail. So that's, again, something to check with your local election authority.
In order, okay. Do we want to address the first part of that?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. I don't believe that having a signature with the DMV is necessary. Yeah, I don't think so. But the early voting and voting by mail options were specifically like expanded this year to avoid these individuals registering, or to avoid as much in-person registration as possible. So I really don't think that this signature it'll require a signature, just because like that's like a huge barrier. And I'm not sure. When I was researching, that didn't come up at all. So no, I don't think so.
And we can double check on that and get back to you, of course. We
Yeah.
also, I think, do we have other Q&A questions? Because we have some in chat as well. It looks like Terry has another question in the Q&A.
Yeah, so I think that Florida and Arizona, like we mentioned in the slides, they really just they had already invested in early voting systems and voting by mail options before, which, like I mentioned, is something that Illinois didn't do until this omnibus election bill was passed in late March. So I think that's like the largest reason why there was such a high turnout. It's not because like we hadn't, like they have significantly more people who want to vote. It's just like the state, it was more safer methods were more accessible to these people. Yeah, I think that's really the answer. It didn't really have anything to do with PR. It's just the existing systems.
All right, our first question in chat from Tamara is ID required in the vote by mail application or when you send in the ballot by mail?
All right. I think for the vote by mail application, okay, is the ID required in the vote by mail application or when do you send in the ballot by mail? So the thing with voting by mail is that, so for example, if you take a look at the comparison for early voting, you don't actually need to bring in forms of ID. You really only need that, like those two types of identification if you're registering to vote. But early voting, you don't actually need to bring an ID. So with that sort of comparison, as long as you've registered to vote already, like whether it be online or in another manner, I don't think ID is required for the vote by mail application or like sending the ballot.
Oh, sorry. Just before we answer any more questions, I just want to quickly bring up something that Ms. Jan Dorner said in the Q&A. Apparently, one does need to have a signature on file in order to register online. So I apologize for saying incorrect information earlier. That was completely my bad. To answer someone else's question, yes, you do need to have a signature on file. Otherwise, you would need to register in person.
And so if you have a driver's license, if you have applied for that, when you know that on your driver's license you do have that signature. So it is on file if you got the driver's license, which is the typical way that most people will be registering and including their driver's license number when they do the online registration, but that does need to be on file. If you have any issues, if registering right now, if you can't register online, please reach out to us and we will find the safest way that you can do that so that you hopefully do not have to go to the DMV or another crowded location to do that. We'll work with you to make sure that can happen.
The next question I see is, does a signature on the ballot have to match registration signature or application signature? So yes, ideally it should match, but like even if it's like a little bit off, it should just be similar and they won't count you out. But just make sure that it's not radically different, like you didn't like write completely in wacko cursive or something. Just make sure that it's somewhat similar and you should be fine.
I see another question. I think it was sent a bit earlier into the chat, but I don't think we actually addressed it. The question is, can you give some info about how absentee ballots and early ballots are counted compared to in-person voting at polling places? So I believe absentee ballots are inserted into vote counting machines, and they're registered and retained before election day. Again, they're not counted until election day, so November 3rd. So that's just kind of how it's done in terms of absentee ballots.
The next question is, will Illinois have barcodes to track mail-in ballots, or is that determined by each county?
That's a good question. I think I'm not sure if like I'm like I remember I know I said like that ballots specifically have like very specific tracking systems. So for example, barcodes, but I'm not sure if that is sort of organized into a statewide category or if it's organized into a county-wide category.
I don't want to answer that one with any certainty, because this again gets to Terry's question about the decentralized nature of our elections. We have the local election authorities determine how their ballots work. So that's going to be county by county. I think it's pretty common, but I would not be surprised if there are counties out there that are still not doing that. And I see that Jan chimed in with each county as well. So I think you would have to check county by county to be sure on that. And it is a good practice. It's a great way to track ballots and to make sure that we have that extra layer of security and accountability. Let me see if there are any other current questions in here. I see that Sean has chimed in chat about the signature on file. And that is a great point. You can mail in if you do not have your signature on file. And that's actually the form that we often use when we do in-person voter registration. If we aren't doing it online, those forms are the same. And you, of course, sign that form. And that's the signature that you're going to have on file. Any other questions? I want to give everyone a moment or two to chime in. Okay, well, thank you for everyone for joining. Thank you for those of us who helped answer some of these questions with your experiences. Thank you again to Kate and Shreya. This was really incredible. I'm so impressed with the job you guys did tonight, all the research that went into it and into the presentation. Thank you for answering all these questions. CAC is here through the election and beyond, of course, to answer any other questions you have. I want to reiterate again that our presentations like these are, of course, educational in nature and not meant to be direct legal advice, but you can always reach out to us with your specific questions, and we are here to answer them. Thank you, everyone. I hope to see you in the next couple of weeks. Kate and Shreya, if you have any last words, I want to give you the opportunity, of course.
Well, all right. Thank you for that opportunity. Sorry, Shreya, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll just go real quick. Thank you all so much for being here again. The fact that everyone on this call took time out of their schedule to be here with us in the middle of a global pandemic to engage in civic engagement is really something that amazes me and something that I personally don't take for granted. So thank you all again. I hope that you guys took something away from this presentation and you learned something new. I know that I definitely did while I was working with Kate on this presentation. And I learned something new from this Q&A session. I did not know about the signature thing, so thank you for informing me of that. And I apologize for relaying the inaccurate information, and I'll be sure to work on that in the future.
All right. I just also want to reiterate what Treya said. I really learned a lot by conducting this presentation and also just by answering the questions. Something I kind of want to bring up is just the fact that the presentation we shared earlier in the chat, that was also sent out potentially to all of your emails before this actually began. Feel free to use that presentation in whatever manner you deem the most appropriate. Ultimately, I think everybody's goal here tonight was to try and educate and spread information about the omnibus election bill and how to vote amidst COVID-19. So that was our ultimate goal. We would be really happy if you gained anything from this, and we are totally open to you guys using the presentation so that you can just like keep in track of all of the dates and all of the ways to just get involved. So I want to reiterate that that presentation is really open for everybody's usage. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It means a lot. And I really do hope that this helped impact you and helped make you feel a little more confident about voting this election cycle.
Thanks again, everyone. We will have the presentation available probably on our website as well as our Facebook page. And you can reach out to me if you have any trouble accessing that. And we will have the recording available too, so you can see the live recorded presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. These presentations would not be possible without your support. We really appreciate donations if you can make them, and you can find a link to do that on our website. We hope to see you in the next few weeks at our intern night, our democracy night on July 29th, as well as on a second presentation by Shreya and Kate on August 5th about civic engagement and mobilization during this pandemic. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night. Take care and stay healthy.
Yep. Thanks, Shreya. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye.